Erev Tov, everybody. Good evening. Good to see all of you here. I'm kind of liking this setup. We haven't done this so often, but I'm very comfortable. I hope you are too. It's so good to see everybody here tonight, and I want to welcome you to TBS for our conversation with Dr. Rachel Fish about where anti-Semitism in Israel intersect on college campuses, a topic that I know we've been thinking a lot about as not only since October 7th, but before that, but particularly since October 7th, and this really important conversation, which is something that we've been having our community about anti-Semitism in a variety of ways. Our social advocacy committee, working with the ADL, having a wonderful series speak about anti-Semitism too, and now we're looking forward to this conversation tonight with Dr. Fish. As we get started, I want to thank Gigi and Brad Schwartz for sponsoring Dr. Fish's visit and to be with her today. I'm very grateful for your support and ongoing support for that and having great conversations like this. You should know also we've been keeping Dr. Fish pretty busy after she landed late last night from a conference from Denver. She did a couple sessions this morning, including a session with the middle school at Kalman Brown Academy, which was a really wonderful session. We even extended the time that we were going to be there with her as they asked some really great questions about anti-Semitism and Israel, the students there. We got to spend some time with her as a senior staff today, but we've been very much looking forward to this conversation tonight with her and talking about this important topic. I have a... I'm just going for Rachel. You can go for Micah. It's okay too. So Rachel is a very impressive person. She's co-founded the nonprofit Boundless, which is a think action tank partnering with community leaders across North America to revitalize Israel education and to take bold action to combat Jew hatred. She also serves as the special advisor to the Brandeis University Presidential Initiative to Counter Antisemitism in Higher Education, and is an associate research professor at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies. She also teaches at George Washington University as well in the graduate school there, a course in Israeli history. Before that, she was the executive director of the Foundation to Combat Antisemitism and a senior advisor and resident scholar to the Paul E. Singer Foundation and executive director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, where she trained the next generation of academics in the field of Israel studies. In addition to all this, she got her PhD from history in Brandeis. She is as she likes to say, a mother of 4 children and 2 dogs, and is also the chair of the board of her local Jewish community day school in Boston as well, where she's from. But I'll say this is on a personal note, it's really wonderful having Rachel here because Rachel and I first met when we were 17 years old on a Ramah seminar in Israel. Rachel went to Camp Ramah in Palmer, and I went to Wisconsin, and we traveled to Israel together that summer on the same program, and we're actually in the same group. We met that summer and became friends, and been able to see each other here and there over the years. And when Brad said, "If you heard of Rachel Fish, we got to bring her in," I could say, absolutely. It'd be good to see her after all this time. It's been wonderful catching up with you today and having you here at TBS, and looking forward to our conversation tonight. So the way evening is going to go is Rachel and I are going to be in conversation here tonight, and we're going to talk a little bit for about 40 minutes or so. Then we're going to open it up for questions, not sermons, those happen up there, but questions about our topics and follow-ups and things like that. Then afterwards, Evan's invited to the Friedman Social Hall for some dessert and further conversation. So we're glad you're here tonight. Welcome to all those who are joining us on the live stream as well. And Rachel, welcome to Temple Beth Shalom. So I thought we'd start, just getting to know you a little bit, and what got you into anti-Semitism, right? Like what, how does someone, start out and say, like, I'm going to fight anti-Semitism for a living, which unfortunately we didn't know would be such a growth industry when we were growing up, but it's something that you do very well, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what brought you to this position and to the wonderful work that you do.
Okay, first, it's truly a pleasure to be here. It's very nice to be with you, Rabbi Peltz, and you all are a very lovely community. I have had a chance to be here, as Micah said, much of the day, and it is really a pleasure, and I appreciate all of the young students in the back, so thank you for being here. Let me tell you a little bit about who I am. Like, that's all nice, but that's not everything. Um, let me frame it a little bit. So I grew up in a small town in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains in Northeast Tennessee. Johnson City, Tennessee. Yeah, it's not.
Who knows somebody from Johnson City? Somebody's got to know someone from Johnson City, Tennessee.
Somebody's going to say they know the Tri-Cities. It's not far from Knoxville. All that is true. But it is not Cherry Hill, New Jersey. It is not Boston. It is not D.C. It is not Philly. It is not New York, truly. Out of my town and 6 surrounding towns, there were 60 Jews total. 1 synagogue, so everyone's got to get along. 1 student rabbi that came from Hebrew Union College once a month, fly in and out on a weekend. All lay leadership, no Jewish organizational life. All these organizations that exist, we had none of them. So you learn at a very, very young age that you are part of something much bigger than yourself. My family was very involved in Jewishness, Jewish life, and so we learned that if you didn't go to shul, someone couldn't say Kaddish, and that was real. So it was different. It's also what we call the buckle of the Bible Belt. Truly wonderful human beings, kind, generous, warm, know nothing about Jews, can't find Israel on a map, know nothing about Judaism. And at a young age, you have to be able to articulate who you are and what makes you different. So everything from why you don't go to every Friday night football game, which is truly religion in the South, to why you have to be able to explain that you don't eat bacon after a sleepover or pepperoni pizza at someone's birthday party. When I was very young, I used to make rounds with my father. Some of you heard this story this morning, before HIPAA rules were in place. And I have a vivid memory as probably a 5 or 6-year-old walking into a new mom's room who had just had a baby. My father was a pediatrician. And the mother said I could come in. And she put her hands on my head and wanted to see where my horns were. Right? It wasn't malicious. Just didn't know. The story that I shared this morning that I often talk about, I think epitomizes sort of my DNA, which is when I was in 7th grade, I went to a public school, and I went to use the restroom, always with the teacher's permission, and I saw a student in my grade etching a swastika in my locker. I went back to my classroom. I told the teacher what I had seen with this student. Now, this was a student who did not care about school. This was a student who I can assume did not come from a very supportive family. This was a student who had failed a few grades before me and was now in my grade. So it gives you a sense of the type of individual this was. And when I told my teacher, the teacher told the principal, that evening when I came home that afternoon, I told my parents so they would know what happened. At dinner that evening, a phone call came, and I can picture the phone attached to a wall with a cord. And at dinner, my father saying to the principal, yes, Rachel shared with us what happened, and we'd like to know what the steps will be taken by the school. And the principal said that they were going to suspend the student. So my father covers the mouthpiece and says they're going to suspend the student. And I said, that's a terrible idea. My dad said, hold on, to the principal. And he said, what do you mean it's a terrible idea? And I said, this kid doesn't even want to be in school. It's the last place he wants to be. And it's not going to help him. He's not going to learn. So I actually think that he should come to school. And I would like to meet with him every day. And this is what I knew at the time. And I said, I will read to him the Diary of Anne Frank. And so I met with Jamie Pearson every day for several months. And I read to him in this room that was like in school suspension with just him. And saw Jamie. Didn't ignore Jamie. And met with him. Now, this is not some after-school special where Jamie and I became best friends. We did not. But I will tell you that Jamie graduated with my class. Jamie never drew another swastika. Jamie never did anything to my younger brother. Jamie never said anything anti-Semitic. And for me, it was an opportunity to call in order to see someone and help them gain some knowledge and understanding so that they don't continue to do the same thing again and again. And so that is the kind of orientation and sort of like how I'm wired. And I think I didn't make a conscious choice to say, now I'm going to become a professional who fights anti-Semitism, but I think that sort of response in terms of wanting to educate is my natural inclination.
So thank you for sharing that beautiful story, which I think really says a lot about you and who you are, and gives us a great introduction to the work that you do. So let's jump into that work, right, and talk about those campuses, which I know has brought a lot of people here today. Could you talk a little bit about the work you do with college campuses and fighting anti-Semitism, and also to help support Israel, and what you see from your position, which really allows you to look out and see a broader perspective of what's happening on campuses and the different layers of challenges that exist there?
So I think what I would say to start that conversation is that what you are seeing today did not start on October 8th. This did not begin the day after. This has actually been building for decades, and there are a variety of factors that have contributed to the hostility that we see playing out on college campuses today. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to just name some of those elements. There are a set of intellectual factors that have been part of the humanities really since the period of the 1960s. And these are ideas that, when taken alone, individually, they can be useful tools to think critically, to engage with a lot of different subjects in all different kinds of disciplines: history, sociology, anthropology, etc., literature. But what has happened is that these intellectual ideas have become sort of a package deal. And they now have created a prism through which all ideas are refracted. So let me just name some of these intellectual ideas to give you a sense. So the idea of Marxism. And here it's not about economics, but it's about power. And the idea of Marxism in this case is that those who are strong ought to be weakened, and those who are weak ought to be strengthened. The idea of post-colonialism, which really emerges in the 1960s, or some would say decolonization theory. Post-colonialism says that anything that has anything to do with the colonialist world should be assumed to be created in sin. The idea of post-nationalism, which says that all the problems in the world are because of the rise of sovereign nation states. The idea of postmodernism, which comes from literature in the 1980s, which sets up a framework that says all facts should be debated, no facts are objective, and narratives weigh more than facts. I can tell you as a historian, that is very hard for me. Facts matter in my world. There can be lots of narratives that are built around those facts or interpret those facts, but if car A hits car B, car A hits car B. The idea of Orientalism, which comes from Edward Said, who wrote the book in the 1970s, Columbia professor in comparative literature, Palestinian heritage. Orientalism becomes a very important text, which suggests that anyone who comes from the West cannot impose Western values on the Orient, the East. And so that also is going to be an important component of these intellectual factors. Now, these ideas don't just stay in higher education. They start in higher education, but they are ideas that then influence many of our making meaning institutions, whether it's journalism, whether it's think tanks, whether it's media, traditional or social media, whether it's schools of social work or education, also in terms of many of the social justice movements that many of us are involved in and care about. And when you put all of these ideas together, it creates a very superficial and simplistic narrative. And it goes like this. Jews are part of the white majority and are not a vulnerable minority. As part of the white majority, by extension, Israel is a white colonialist imperialist outpost that has displaced the dark-skinned native, indigenous, authentic population, i.e. the Palestinians. It is a very, very simplistic, superficial framing. And that framing is one that is utilized to suggest that Israel then is created in sin. And one of the worst things for anyone today in the 21st century in America is to be associated with something that is perceived as being apartheid, racism, or smacking of colonialism. So that's one huge component that I think is very important for all of you to understand. And why I think it's important to understand is because this conversation and the way these ideas emerge do not wait until your students come on college campuses. They also are already part of educational frameworks as early as middle school and high school, sometimes even younger. So that's piece one. Piece two is that, for the most part, Americans, let alone American Jews, did not pay attention to the billions of dollars flooding our institutions, particularly in higher ed, but not exclusively, coming from foreign governments, specifically in the Arab world. That means many of the institutions we care about were bought. They weren't only bought, they determine who teaches in them, which means they determine what is taught in them. And for some of them, it extends once again way beyond higher education, because there are public outreach initiatives that are specific to training educators. Not just educators, but Georgetown University trains foreign service agents through their Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, paid for by Saudi Arabia. So there are lots of these kinds of examples I could give, but foreign funding is another piece of this. The third element, I would say, in terms of the campus, is the way in which university administrators have become very, very conflict averse. They want to keep their head down, and they don't want to deal with the issues that are most tenuous. And what has happened as a result of that is that faculty have truly begun to rule the roost. And it doesn't take many faculty. But once that happens, it creates a certain herd mentality, and you start to see a diminishing of diversity of thought in all different subjects, let alone how it impacts the conversation around the collective Jewish political identity and the state of Israel. And so these are central components to understanding what's really happening on our campus and to make sense of what you are now seeing, which did not begin October 8th.
So thank you for the frameworks, but so all those things are at work, right? They're happening, but let's bring it down to a student who goes onto campus, right? I remember 25 years ago-ish, I went to the University of Michigan. They won a national championship, by the way, right? Everyone saw that? But there's a large Arab population at Michigan, right? And I remember when I was there 25 years ago, there were checkpoints set up and there were protests that were happening, but nothing like, we're seeing today, right? So a student walking onto a campus like that, and you're showing these structural issues that are there too, how are students supposed to live in that environment, or how can students be able to get that type of education and that experience that they're hoping to get given what's going on?
Look, I think this is where it is very hard, Micah, for students, because there are so many factors in considering where one goes to school and what your own sort of DNA feels up to in terms of navigating that environment. If you're in the hard sciences, there's a very good chance much of this won't touch you, at least not in the classroom. There's some exceptions, for sure. But if you're in the humanities, you should assume that you're going to be impacted by this on multiple levels. In the classroom, in terms of the assignments you have, the readings that you will be doing, and it will make much of that educational process quite challenging and very limiting intellectually. There are so many components, and I'm looking at Allison because I know her job is to help think about where do you send your kids. And what I would say is you actually have to become quite expert or tap the experts to really do a sophisticated understanding of what a campus is like. Because what's the Hillel like? And not just what's the Hillel like, what's the Chabad like? And then is there a Jewish studies program, but are the Jewish studies faculty in favor of BDS, or are they not? Are there Israel studies faculty? Where do they fall in terms of the conversation? Are they intellectually engaged, or are they taking a particular political ideological position? Right? These are components, and we have to understand how to sort of distill what then the essence is on the campus, because not every campus is burning, and especially not at every moment. And there is a reality that student government resolutions around BDS have become the norm, that certain student groups on campus will purposefully create litmus tests to exclude those students who identify with Israel and Zionism. Very clearly, that have nothing to do with the subject, meaning students who create organizations because they were victims of sexual abuse, students who are part of climate change organizations who are told you can't be part of these organizations because you are part of a Zionist entity. Right? Like, that's a different reality than when you and I were on campus.
So I have a 10th grader at home. You have a 9th grader, I know, at home. We have our Kesher students here from TBS and Bethel, right, for between 9th and 12th grade, in varying degrees thinking about college. What do you say to them? What are you going to say to your own son as he moves up? And how do we prepare them, and what do we talk to them about as they prepare to go to a college campus?
I actually think you all are in a very unique situation. I'm looking right at you all as you think about colleges, because you can be very, very discerning in your choices. You also do not have to accept anybody's crumbs, ever. If someone tells you you can't be part of their organization because you're Zionist or you identify with Israel in whatever shape or form, walk away with pride, standing tall, and start your own organization. You never have to just succumb to the presuppositions or the ideas of these other groups, ever. And I think that's really important. One of the best pieces of advice that I ever received was, you just need a gang. A handful of people that you can turn to at any moment in time so that you don't feel alone. And that's truly what you need. You don't need a massive organization. You just need a group of individuals like yourself who show respect, kindness, humility. You're willing to be critical thinkers, but you're not going to take somebody's position just because that's become the dominant position. Like, your critical thinking skills deeply matter. So you're in a position to be a very serious consumer before you make a choice, and you don't have to accept any product that's out there. And the other piece I would say is that I really hope the operating systems inside of you that you have had cultivated from your parents and your Jewish education here at TBS and other places serve as your North Star. That is the operating system that you want to guide you as you start to go through this maturation process and educational journey. And don't diminish that at any moment, because hopefully what you have learned in terms of your Jewishness and your Jewish identity and the ability to hold deeply your particularism with balancing it, your universalism, will serve you incredibly throughout your life.
Great. So I want to, before we go back to the campus, I have another questions about that. Since you brought up particularism, universalism, I want to go a little bit deeper there. I shared on Shabbat, there's an interesting book that came out edited by David Hazony about 65 Jewish priorities is called, and 65 thought leaders list their priorities for the Jewish future. And Rachel is one of those 65 thought leaders that wrote an essay for this book, and I found it and I read it. What she writes about there that I was really taken with is she quotes the great American Jewish author Cynthia Ozick, who says, "When you blow through the narrow end of a shofar, the sound is very loud. But if you blow through the wide end of the shofar, the sound doesn't come out at all." And that's a metaphor for this point to make that Judaism is a particular tradition that has a universal mission, right? We're a particular tradition that has mitzvot, commandments for Jews, but that is meant to impact not only us, but others as well. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about your kind of main thesis from that essay about how we cultivate, say yes to tribalism, as you called it, as tribalism is sometimes not a very good word today, but talk a little about what that means and why you think that is the most important Jewish priority going into the future.
I like saying yes to tribalism, and I think the reason I find that compelling is because there is a healthy idea of tribalism. It doesn't have to be parochial and jingoistic and very narrow. I also think that human nature is one built upon tribes, family units. They can grow, but there is a natural inherent identity in terms of one's tribe. And the other reason I really like it is because, at least in terms of Jewish history and Jewish tradition, we are an ethno-religious community. And for much of the American Jewish experience, that ethno piece, that peoplehood piece, has been diminished. Part of it was because of the unique background of America, emerging at a time in which it's about trying to be able to protect different religious minority communities. And so Judaism starts to fit into that religious minority, and that peoplehood piece is a little bit marginalized in order for American Jews to integrate into the larger society and become part of the melting pot in this new Zion. And that's important. But the ethno piece of Jewishness, I think, is essential to understanding why we feel we're part of a collective, this idea of Klal Yisrael, the idea of why we care so much about our brothers and sisters in Israel, the world's largest Jewish population, because it's not just religion, because not everyone practices Judaism in the same way. It's a component around a peoplehood identity. And so that, to me, is very valuable and very compelling. And I also think we live in a world in which so many identity communities are allowed to advocate based upon their identity for a particular tribal identity, and Jews are often excluded from being able to do that. And I actually think we need to reclaim it, not to isolate ourselves from others at all, but to, again, model how you can be deeply particularistic while also constantly thinking about the responsibility for the universal. That's, in my mind, pretty revolutionary.
Yeah. It reminds us last Shabbat, we read in Torah the Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, right? This idea that we should be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, which some commentaries see as, kingdom of priests, this idea of our particular responsibilities, and a holy nation is that idea of being a light unto the nations, right? Both of those encapsulated in that phrase. So let's go back into this idea of peoplehood that you're talking about, right, and how we're connected to Jews around the world, which of course I think we've all felt more acutely since October 7th, though it's always been an important thing. But that connection we can feel in a very positive way, but also is a connection that gets played out in a negative way, and here we're getting to the title of our talk about that intersection between anti-Semitism and Israel, right? So is there a difference or is there no difference between anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, criticism of Israel? That's something that we hear a lot about. What's your take on that?
So we had a student in the middle school today ask this question. That's how good your middle school students are. And I said to that student not to evade the question, because I did answer the question, but that asking me that question doesn't mean it's the answer for every Jew, right? Not all of us are going to agree on the answer to most questions, let alone this question, right? That being said, I look at this historically, and then I look at it in a very concrete way. So let me say what I mean by historically. One, anti-Zionist positions existed during the emergence of the rise of Zionism. There were anti-Zionist positions throughout Europe, the Boundless, the autonomous, people who did not think that Zionism was the answer, and they were still deeply part of the Jewish community. They weren't excommunicated. Once you have the Zionist movement in full force, you see that the majority of Zionists who are engaged in that conversation do not agree with one another. Just look at the first Zionist Congress in 1897 and read the writings of Theodor Herzl and Achad Ha'am, and you will see mortal enemies. These two men had very different ideas about what a future Jewish state should look like, what its essence should be, and what its actual objective was. Completely different. And I say that once again because I don't want people to think there's a homogenous or monolithic position around Zionism. The major book that was edited by Arthur Hertzberg is called The Zionist Idea. It's a very important and worthwhile text, but it should have been called The Zionist Ideas.
It was Gil Troy came out with the book exactly that title.
Exactly, and that's why Gil did that. And he updated it with some modern contemporary thinkers. Now, we also know that critiquing the state of Israel happens in the Jewish community, happens outside of the Jewish community. I've never met a Jew, whether Israeli or not, who doesn't critique the state of Israel once it's established. That is completely within the bounds of acceptability. 10 months prior to October 7th, you saw that critique playing out in the streets in a very serious and meaningful way, with a lot of passion, emotion, real challenges. That is part of what it means to live in a Jewish democratic society. The issue for me is when, de facto, the state exists. So once you have the Jewish state, critique policy all you want. But if the starting place is, does Israel have a right to exist? And it's the only nation state's right to exist that you question, that to me is no longer a critique of policy, but a suggestion that Jews are the only people who don't have the agency for self-determination. And for me, that then falls into the category of anti-Semitism. Those issues collapse. I said to the students today, I tend to use Natan Sharansky's 3D test. I have found it useful. He created this in the 2000s. Natan Sharansky, former refugenik from the Soviet Union. And in the 2000s, he said, when Israel is held to a double standard, when it is demonized, and when it is delegitimized, you have to ask what the intent is and assume that this is about anti-Semitism and it is no longer about criticism. So I have found that to be a useful starting place. I have a lot of colleagues in the higher ed space who are debating what is anti-Semitism. We have the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which has been accepted by the United States State Department. It is the accepted working definition of anti-Semitism. It is what is used in terms of making sense of why Jews can be protected under Title VI from the Office of Civil Rights from 1964. There's a separate definition that challenged the IHRA definition. That definition is called the Jerusalem Declaration, and it limits the way in which it sees the criticism of Israel and gives it, or I should say, it's more expansive. It doesn't see those 3 Ds as a problem in the way that I've defined them. And then there's another definition called the Nexus document that came from University of Southern California. So we have a community that also cannot agree on the definition, even though we have this working definition that has been accepted in many governments, institutions, etc. But why I say this is because I don't actually need a definition, and here's where I'm very concrete, to tell me that when Jewish students are hiding in a library and don't feel safe to get out, that's anti-Semitism. I don't need the definition. I don't need a definition when I hear of students getting their Magen David or their Chai necklace ripped off their necks, that's not anti-Semitism. I don't need a definition when I hear about students who are getting bullied online because they posted images of an Israeli flag. I don't need a definition when I see at Columbia University a skunk that says no Israelis allowed with an Israeli flag on it, or Yale just the other day that said no IDF soldiers welcome on campus. I don't need a definition anymore. And I have to tell you, that's where many of my colleagues in higher education do not like me, because I refuse to play an abstract theoretical game of definitions, and I am much more interested in understanding the intent of what is happening on campus, which is directly to target and discriminate and persecute Jews and those who identify with Zionism.
Good answer. Good answer. So while we're there, though, let's talk a little more about definitions and word usages. Right?
Now I'm getting fired up.
I know. This is what I was hoping for.
Ready.
So word usages, right? We've been using anti-Semitism, right? In your bio, it also talks about Jew hatred, and I talked about this a little earlier today. Talk a little bit about the difference in language there and why and when you might use anti-Semitism versus Jew hatred and the history of those terms.
Okay. So we did some very interesting research several years ago. We asked 13 to 35-year-olds in America, demographically representative. We had a huge sample size, 10,500 13 to 35-year-olds. That's huge. When we asked them, what is anti-Semitism? The majority responded IDK. IDK is
what does that mean,
know.
Teens out there?
Yeah. I don't know. The majority. We then heard the following. Well, what's a Semite? That was the question they asked us. It's actually a very fair question. It's a very odd term. It is not one that you use every day. And so they want clarification around it. And then we heard the following. I'm anti-racist, I'm anti-homophobic, I'm anti-Islamophobic, so I must be an anti-Semite. We were like, no, 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 no. You're an anti-Semite. But the construct of the word is very confusing. A second piece of this is that the individual who coins the term anti-Semitism, Antisemitumus in Germany, is Wilhelm Marr in 1879. He coins that term to replace the term Judenhass, hatred of Jews, Jew hatred. He uses that term because he wanted to make it politically correct, more acceptable, easier to hate Jews, sanitize it. And so it gets picked up. Also, that anti-Semitism piece, the Semite, suggests a racial categorization. So now it's not just about Jew as a religion, but now it's about hating a particular people, which is, again, why I like to reclaim tribalism. So I don't really like to use terms by anti-Semites. And I feel like go back to the original term. So we tested the term Jew hatred. With the 13 to 35-year-olds, when we said Jew hatred, every single one got it. Now, we did have some complaints. 50 years old and older in the Jewish community hated the term Jew hatred. We heard the following. When you say Jew hatred, it is very direct and it is very crass. To which I say yes. And that is why I use it. Because Jew hatred is crass, and we need to be direct about it. So, when I am in a non-Jewish audience, I almost primarily only use Jew hatred. If I'm in a community like this, I use the terms anti-Semitism and Jew hatred synonymously.
Very interesting. Good. So I have some more questions, but I think I'm going to pause here. I know we've got a good group that I'm sure has some good questions as well. I'm going to ask Rabbi Wexler to come and help us with that. If you do have a question, we ask that you raise your hand and please ask the question. Again, save the sermons for the Bima and ask the question, and Rachel will do her best to answer, which I'm sure will answer very well. Okay.
So I believe that the whole basis for what's going on right now with anti-Semitism is all stems from Netanyahu's indiscriminate approach to bombing the heck out of the Palestinians in order to get at Hamas. And he's trying to defend it, that he's trying to destroy Hamas, but he's killed thousands and thousands of innocent Palestinians in so doing. And I can't accept that. Can you help me?
So I think part of the question that I would say, sure.
What I'm saying is that two wrongs don't make a right.
I hear you. So, sure, I will, tell me if I do service to your question. The question is, much of what we see playing out today in terms of the anti-Semitism that we see playing out is because of Prime Minister Netanyahu's actions after October 7th, in terms of the way in which he has retaliated or instructed the retaliation against Hamas and Gaza, which has resulted in the killing of thousands of individuals. Is this fair so far? And two wrongs don't make a right, so how do I make sense of this? I would say the following. First of all, the loss of human life is always a serious loss, and we shouldn't feel good about it. That's what makes us human. That's also what makes us deeply compassionate human beings. And also, this is part of our Jewishness, right? We don't celebrate in the destruction of our enemies. That's not something we do. Secondly, the retaliation, Israel's response, did not begin on October 8th. It did not begin on the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th either. Israel waited 2.5, 3 weeks before responding. What we see happening did not wait 2 to 3 weeks. It was already happening on October 8th on college campuses. It did not wait until Netanyahu's response. It's very important. Thirdly, we don't know how many individuals who have been killed in Gaza are associated with Hamas. We have no idea. We don't have a good number because we can't accept the number coming from the Hamas Ministry of Health. I can't accept it. That's a terrorist organization. So it poses a serious issue. And I'm not saying that the number should tell the whole story. But when I hear individuals say it's a genocide, I can't accept that either because I know what a genocide is. I know the legal definition. A genocide is intent to kill a particular people. That is not what Israel is doing. It's not. Now, it is a war. And a war is a terrible, terrible thing. It's all the more so terrible when you have a terrorist dictatorial regime that refuses to allow innocent members of its society to leave. And not only refuses, but uses them as human shields in order to protect the terrorists. Now, when I say that, there are going to be plenty of people who tell me they don't believe that. Okay, I can't control for them not believing it. But that is what is happening. We have heard this time and time again from Palestinians who live in Gaza. We have heard it from individuals who have tried to get out and can't get out. The other day, when humanitarian aid was supposed to enter into Gaza, what happened to the trucks? They were hijacked by Hamas. The Palestinians didn't get the food. And not only were they hijacked by Hamas, but armed gunmen then started transporting weapons to other parts of Gaza. I don't know what to do with that. So here's the thing that I want to say about this. Jews hold real power in the state of Israel. We have a military, we have elected officials, whether we like them or not, and trust me, there are plenty of us who don't, but they make political decisions and military decisions. And in this case, those military decisions are being made by individuals in order to determine how best to eradicate as much of the Hamasniks as possible from Gaza before we begin another war with Hezbollah, another radical Islamist group, and before potential violence erupts even more seriously in the West Bank, where Hamas has a strong foothold and Fatah is very weak. When Iran controls much of what's going on and is also influenced by Russia. This is not just a local conflict. Now, if we can have that conversation, and we can talk about how difficult it is for Jews to hold real power, knowing that these kinds of decisions are not black and white, then that means we can have a serious conversation with other folks who refuse to hold that complexity and who just want me to damn Israel. I will not do it. And it doesn't mean that I don't also feel great human loss for the innocents, and then I have to pause and say the following, which is very hard to say. I don't know how many are innocent in Gaza. There are many children who are. But to tell me that since 2007, nobody knew about these tunnels that were being built, nobody understood what the Hamas charter has said since 1988, I find it very hard to believe. So that's how I would respond to that.
You really nicely summarized the challenges that all of us, but especially college students right now, are dealing with, where pro-Israel Jewish students are seen as colonialist and racist, and that Jews are the only minority that are not entitled to DEI. How does a college student address that? What are your recommendations for all of us, but especially for the students right now that are stuck in that position and dealing with that sentiment?
It's actually a serious challenge because some of the usual steps that one should take aren't actually effective. Meaning, usually, if you encounter some form of discrimination, you're going to go to the DEI officer. But what happened when we saw, for example, at some universities where Jewish students went up to their DEI officers with literal tears in their eyes saying they are chanting genocidal chants, do something, and they said, nothing we can do, right? So it's a serious issue. If a true hostile environment is created on campus, which is a legal definition as well, it needs to be able to have a Title VI complaint opened. That's actually very important. I do have to tell you that there are many egregious things that happen, whether it's inside the classroom, student organizations, outside speakers who are brought on campus to agitate, where nobody reports it. Nobody. It is very hard to do anything if there is no reporting, because there is no accountability then, and it just becomes a he said, she said. So you actually have to encourage students to actually go and make the report, even if they think it's not going to do anything, because it leads to more action. The other thing is that they can demand to meet with, and I do say demand because they are going to have to fight to get the meeting with key university administrators, but they shouldn't stop there. They then need to go write letters and emails and write to the board and connect with the board of trustees. The board of trustees have to know what's going on. Then they need to look around and say, who are the names on all of these buildings, and reach out to every single one of those donors. And they need to be able to say to the donors, here's the situation. Help me. What are you going to do about it? We can't just tell our students, like, just don't do anything. That's not really an option, because otherwise you can't reclaim these spaces, and they're not going to be what they're supposed to be, which is institutions that allow for the marketplace of ideas. They also will continue to be corrupt. The rot will grow thicker and thicker. And so we actually need to teach our students how to navigate, advocate, and ultimately be ready to take action. But it means being a little bit of a pit bull and not letting it go.
Yeah, I have a 12th grader, a 10th grader, and 2 8th graders. Your oldest is what, a 9th grader?
My oldest is ninth
So
grade.
are you going to, let's say the atmosphere is relatively unchanged. Are you going to suggest that your oldest go to a school that's traditionally been a high academic achieving institution, but may have anti-Semitism problems now, like Penn? Or are you going to look for an environment that's more comfortable for them?
So we actually were talking about this at dinner. And I would answer it in the following way. It's not so much that I need an environment that's comfortable. I like being in environments that are uncomfortable. That's how I grow. I actually want my kids to be in environments that challenge them, but of course create both brave spaces so they can be in conversation, be intellectually curious, hear things with which they will completely disagree, and have the skills to be able to engage in that discussion, knowing that they're not going to come to a point of consensus. Physical safety, obviously, I care about. But I don't want them to be in these quote-unquote safe spaces so that they're not challenged. I'm not saying you're saying that, but I do hear that from parents a lot. I don't adhere to the safe space rule. Physical safety, yes, but not intellectual safety. I say that because, put aside the anti-Semitism just for a second, the institutions that you're naming, the ones that we all think of so easily and the ones that are having all of the problems they're having today, they have become institutions that ultimately cow to a herd mentality and a certain litmus test at the expense of being that marketplace of ideas. They have not created those brave spaces. They have faculty who are bullies to ensure that brave spaces don't exist unless it adheres to a particular set of intellectual positions. I don't want to pay $60,000 for that. I'm not going to do it. I'm not. Now, if my kid said, look, this is the school I want to go to, and I got a basketball scholarship, right? You know, we would discuss. But in all seriousness, it's part of what has to be considered is the own sort of DNA or comfort of the student. Are they going to feel comfortable being in this environment? Is it going to be a fight every single day? Are they going to be physically assaulted? That happens now. Right? Like, those are real questions. And at the same time, if they said, this is the environment that works for me, I'd have to think through that with them. I don't think there's a one size fits all. I don't. I also think there are a lot of other institutions that we can consider now that may not have been top of mind before, who are rising in the ranks and who are creating those brave spaces and aren't doing it in a way that's politicized. So I want my kids to become sharp, critical thinkers while holding on to that particularism, having physical safety, but being intellectually brave. So that alone just narrowed down a lot of the schools, right?
Thank you for being here tonight. I was wondering, how can we get foreign money out of our places of higher education where they influence what actually is going on?
So it's a great question. First of all, I'll tell you just a very quick anecdote, and then I'll show you how this connects. When I did my master's degree at Harvard Divinity School. I am not name dropping because nobody wants that name on their resume right now, but it's to tell you the story. The Divinity School is a weird place. That's a place where people come from all different backgrounds to study religion for different purposes. Some because they want to pursue ordination from different traditions, some because of academic reasons, some because of hospice care and more social work orientation, etc. My first day of orientation was September 11th, 2001. Right? That sucks. We walk into a room. The dean is in the room. There are about 160 graduate students from all over the world, all different types of ethnic, national backgrounds, religious backgrounds. He's a professor, a scholar of Islam. He's from North Carolina, Christian man, been at Harvard for quite a long time at the college. And he says the following: we don't know much, and really, we didn't know much. We knew a plane had left from Boston. We didn't know details. Things were really unfolding in real time. And he says, but we can assume that what has happened today is because of the United States' support of Israel. September 11th, 2001. I saw the writing on the wall very quickly. right? So when people say, like, this just started, no. Fast forward several weeks, and Dean Graham and a handful of his colleagues from Harvard University, some different schools, and MIT wrote a full-page ad that they put in the Boston Globe when people still read it. And in this full-page ad, they blamed everything on Israel. Remember, it was the period of the Second Intifada. They misquoted UN Resolution 242. They basically said that Palestinians have no agency, and everything that was unfolding in Israel was because of Israel's existence. It was the precursor to boycott, divestment, and sanctions. If you remember, after September 11th, there was a huge uptick in anti-Semitism in the Arab world. Remember, Egypt on state-sponsored television started airing a dramatization of the protocols of the Elders of Zion? So these kinds of things were happening. I decided to organize a conference at the Divinity School on global anti-Semitism because nobody was talking about it at Harvard, and it seemed like someone should talk about it. And I brought in all different kinds of speakers. And one of the individuals I brought in said that Harvard had accepted funds from a source that was promoting anti-Americanism and anti-Semitism. In that room, there were about, 130 folks, faculty, administrators, students, and most people just stared blankly, didn't seem to pay attention to what was being said. I went up to that speaker afterwards and wanted to learn more, and what I wound up doing was research. I'm very good at asking questions. And so I started digging because I wanted to understand who did Harvard accept money from and what was it going to be used for. I was a 22-year-old kid, literally. I started doing research and I learned that the money came from the United Arab Emirates, from the president, which I know is ironic now since the Abrahamic Accords, and that Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan had created a think tank for the Arab League called the Zed Center for Coordination and Follow-Up. When I started digging, I found out they were inviting Holocaust deniers like Roger Garudi and David Irving. They were funding the legal defense for David Irving in Europe. They invited Professor Umyama Jalahama from King Faisal University, who straight up resurrected the blood libel that said Jews were using the blood of non-Jews for, she said, their holiday pastries. These kinds of things. That's a think tank in the Arab world. This material was then translated into Arabic and disseminated throughout the Arab world. I wound up saying, I need to find the terms of agreement. I did not even know what that was. But I needed to know what the legal arrangement was between the university and the donor. So I went to the library and I asked the librarians, and they said, it's probably too recent, so you need to go to the development office. I had no clue what the development office was. The development office, for all of you in the back, is where you actually need people to raise money for the institution. So I went to the development office at Harvard. I'm from Tennessee, I told you. So I played up my Southern roots appropriately, because I don't lie. I'm not a liar. I'm very bad at poker. I wore overalls. I'm not even kidding. I put my hair in pigtails, right? I went to the development office, and I said, hi, my name is Rachel. I'm a graduate student at the Divinity School. I'm doing research. Do you have the terms of agreement between Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan and the Harvard Divinity School? The very nice woman said, we sure do. And she went and got them for me. And then I said, can I have a copy? She was like, yeah. Got a copy. Then she said, we actually have the actual wiring information. Would you like it? And I was like, I would love it. So I walked out, took the pigtails out, and I was like, and I went to a professor's house, John Levinson, and I went to professor's house for Su'udah. It was for Purim. And he had known what I had been working on. I had been sharing it with anyone and everyone, students, faculty, Jewish communal organizations, Hillel. And I said, we got Haman. And we did. And I figured out that the donor had given money and there were problematic terms in the terms of agreement. Big red flags that aren't supposed to be there. One student did that, right? Me. I didn't have an organization. I didn't have a club. I was just on a mission. Then I followed the money. The money led me to Columbia. Given the same amount of money at Columbia for the Center for Palestinian Studies. Rashid Khalidi sits in that position. So I just kept following the money. That money also led me to work with students at Columbia Unbecoming, where we created this pseudo-documentary in 2004 called Columbia Unbecoming. I am not a documentarian, but the students said, people need to know what's happening in our classrooms. 2004. They said it's actually really easy to be Jewish at Columbia. We've got Barnard, we've got JTS, kosher food, great Hillel, great Chabad, but we have issues in the classroom. So they said, can you document what's happening between faculty and students in order to be able to raise awareness with donors, Jewish communal leaders, etc., administrators, alumni. I also interviewed faculty from mostly the Middle East Asian Languages and Cultures Department at Columbia, but I also in other departments in the humanities. Not a single faculty member would go on camera. Not one. I have all these notes to this day of conversations with faculty that are beyond outrageous, that can't be published. And when we met with students, some of them said, can you blur our faces? Can you mask our voices? Because they were afraid of the dynamics or potential repercussions. I'll give you one example. You can watch the film. It's on YouTube, Columbia Unbecoming. I wanted to name it Morano's of Morningside Heights. That was vetoed. Tommy Schoenfeld, an Israeli student, served in the IDF, was in a class with Joseph Mossad. Remember Joseph Mossad a few months ago? He's the one who was saying how exhilarating October 7th was. That guy got tenure. He says to Tommy in his lecture on Arab-Israeli conflict, huge lecture hall, undergraduate course, points to Tommy, who he didn't know, and he said, hey, you're Israeli? Tommy says, yes. He said, so when you served in the IDF, how many Palestinians did you kill? That was 20 years ago. Literally. So how do you get money out? First of all, you have to actually follow the money. Why are we not asking the details of the terms of agreement at Georgetown, at Harvard, from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from the UAE, from Bahrain? As alumni, if it's a public institution, they have to be much more transparent. If it's a private institution, you have to be dogmatic and focused and perseverant in order to actually get the terms of agreement. You can't just get it easily. But then we have to comb through it and say, what are the actual terms? Every single university that receives $250,000 of foreign funding, any foreign funding, has to report it to the government. We have to make sure it's actually being reported. Many of it's not. Have you read Eli Lake's recent research that he reported on in the Free Press? I'm asking, for real, if you didn't, read it. Eli Lake did a whole expose on Qatar and Texas A&M. Why does Qatar want to invest in Texas A&M? No, I'm asking. Why? Shout it out, anybody. Texas A&M has one of the best nuclear programs and engineering programs in the country. In Qatar's terms of agreement, which Texas A&M signed, guess what they signed to agree upon? Every single advancement in scientific research will be fully disclosed to Qatar. Hello? This is a huge problem. We have universities that have branches in Doha. There was a very problematic professor at George Washington University in the psychology department. Title VI complaint was issued against her because she was purposefully targeting Zionist and Israeli students in the classroom. GW decided not to rehire her. She conveniently landed a position in Doha at a university. Americans writ large don't know this, and American Jews don't understand what we're talking about all the time. We have to start connecting these dots. This is not some conspiratorial theory I'm putting out there. This is very, very real. And for sure, Qatar and other places are buying the hearts and minds of the next generation in this country. That is very, very serious. But all it takes is one individual. I can let you borrow my overalls, and you can get those terms of agreement.
Coming.
Thank you. Okay, this is a follow-up question, and it's not political at all. But what role do you believe our federal government should be taking in regards to the millions and millions of dollars that go from our federal government into these institutions regarding hate, anti-Semitism, et cetera?
So it's a great question. And just to show you also historically why it's important what you're asking. So under the Obama administration, I'm not making it political either. I'm going to show you how it's not political. Under the Obama administration, there was already a conversation, for example, about the 1964 Office of Civil Rights Act, which said that any institution that receives federal funding cannot discriminate against race, color, and national origin. That was 1964. Now notice it doesn't say religion. So there was a movement by the Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights under the Obama administration by certain individuals to see, could Jews be protected under that Title VI where it is national origin, because it didn't include religion. It didn't pass under Obama, didn't pass under until it comes to Trump. It had already been a bipartisan effort, though, that had been worked on. When it's passed under Trump, it is passed then to say, specifically, it will protect Jews. That then, under the Biden administration, got expanded to also say Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, Buddhists, under the national origin clause of it. So to show you this is not, it shouldn't be political. And that these conversations were happening way before Trump made this executive order. Because often in the Jewish community, it's talked about as Trump's executive order for Title VI, which led to the protection of Jews under it, but the conversation was already in place. That means, and that's why Title VI matters, that if there is targeted discrimination towards Jews, that has to be reported because all of these institutions receive federal funding, whether it's for grants, for student loans, whether it's for foreign language learning, whether it's for research projects in the sciences, and it puts them in jeopardy and holds them accountable once it's actually a complaint that it has to be investigated. And once it has to be investigated, if there are not interventions or policies that are put in place in order to protect those students from that discrimination and targeting, then that money can be pulled. So that's why it actually matters, and it's not just for Jews. It's for any particular group, race, color, national origin, which has now been expanded. There is another route that also has been starting to be explored, and it's a class action lawsuit. Now, class action lawsuit, and I am not a lawyer, so I'm not going to pretend to know something about something I don't know, but the reason that's different is because if you have a class action lawsuit against a university, you open the university up for discovery. And that goes way beyond the specific complaint that is then going to be explored for Title VI. That means a lot of terms of agreements will be opened up. That means a lot of emails, a lot of questions around certain relationships with other institutions, other funding initiatives. And so there is a whole discussion right now just in terms of strategy about which is the better approach. We don't know the answer yet, but it's part of that conversation. But yes, meaning This is why we actually need Title VI. This is why we need to report these things. Otherwise, Jewish students and those students who identify strongly with a Zionist identity they can't actually hold their institution accountable if they don't report it. And that matters.
Hi. You spoke earlier about how you envision approaching the college process when your kids are of that age. I have a son who's looking towards college next year, and as any parent that's gone through it knows, it's an overwhelming process. You're an expert at all of this. Obviously, all of us here care about this, but how do you recommend parents who don't spend every day at this like you do navigate this on top of all of the other things that we navigate trying to figure out the right school for our kids?
Yeah. Talk to Allison. Business is going to be booming. Look, part of what I'm saying to you is actually, I do think you actually need that checklist. Meaning, for example, Cohen Center, which is a research center at Brandeis University, has done research on using and acquiring data to understand what is the environment like on campuses. That research should help inform some of your thinking. Hillel has research. Find out if the particular university has a cohort of administrators who are part of Hillel's Campus Climate Initiative, or if they participate in Academic Engagement Network's initiative to educate administrators about anti-Semitism and what policies do they have in place, right? Meaning, I say this not to be annoying, but it's going to become a second job for a period of time in order to be able to navigate this. Talk to lots of different types of students, right? Talk to recent graduates. Talk to faculty in different departments. I mean, this is now what it kind of takes. It's not just submitting your SAT scores and writing an essay. That's just not the process anymore. And then you have to really obviously have the hard conversations that are important with your own child. What do they want out of college? Meaning, do they want to be in an environment that might challenge them on a regular basis? Maybe. If they really say, I do not want that, that's an important signal to hear, right? So there's not a one-size-fits-all here, and also I can't tell you go to this resource because they have everything. They don't. You know, AJC is trying to be involved in this, American Jewish Committee, Anti-Defamation League, Brandeis Center, not affiliated with the university, with Ken Marcus and Eliza Lewin, who have been very involved in Title VI issues and doing very important work. They have also lots of resources that talk about lots of different Title VI issues that you should know about so that you're not applying to the top schools that all have Title VI complaints, right? So you're gonna have to do a little homework and digging, and I'm sure Allison really can be helpful, and for real, if I can be helpful, I'm happy to be.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Fisher, for finally saying everything I've been thinking and saying for 20 years. Toda Rabbi. Thank you for doing the hard work and doing the work you're doing. We were talking about Israel and anti-Semitism, but what about the intersection with the elephant in the room, but social media? I think social media has been a big driving factor in the, let's say, connection between these two factors, and then taking what happened October 7th to like full throttle. Should the organized Jewish community be doing a class action lawsuit against social media companies like we saw at Congress last week with parents whose children have been killed because of social media? What's your thoughts?
I hate social media. I'm that person. You guys in the back will appreciate this. My kids aren't allowed to have it, and I have a 9th grader who just got a phone when he went into 9th grade, and he's like, "You are so that parent," and I was like, "I am. Like, I am that parent, and I'm very aware." I do really encourage you, read Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T. He is very clear about the real issues social media promulgate and the negative realities and impacts they have on our own children's development. So I am not a fan of social media. I get a lot of people saying, like, where can I follow you? You can't. Because I don't want to be on these spaces. I don't. Also, social media, I was saying earlier, since the Hamas conflict with Israel, this most recent one, 1 in every 4 pieces of content is coming from Iran or Russia. 1 in every 4. Now, how are you supposed to decipher if it's real or not? Let alone the way in which AI doctors videos, images, language, and on top of all of that, the majority of these responses that you see are inauthentic bot activity that are creating the responses. And the way the algorithms function, what enrages, engages. This is a setup for a disaster, let alone TikTok, which is owned by Communist China and pushing their own agenda. They let their kids watch TikTok for 20 minutes with panda bears. Our kids are getting fed self-harm, right? Issues around gender and identity and sexuality, and issues around Hamas. So the way I think about social media is the advent of the way people probably thought about the printing press, except now it's on steroids. And now we actually have quite an illiterate society on a lot of issues, and yet they're glued to their screens, where we know it takes less than 2 seconds to grab your attention, and it tells you what you think you need to know and feeds a particular perception of an issue. And also, in terms of Israel and Jews, it's the blood libel also on steroids, because lies, misinformation, disinformation spreads like wildfire. It is a very, very big issue. Now, there are a lot of very smart people who are thinking about, if you have social media and it's just part of our reality, what can be done technologically in order to suppress problematic algorithms, amplify good content, and that's an approach. We have no governmental oversight at this point in time, so it can't be reined in, and it's become a major political issue, so it won't be addressed anytime in the near future. And there is a real conversation to be had around, could a class action lawsuit be taken against Meta and other, TikTok and other social media platforms? It's a real question. There are some who are thinking about it. It requires a much more organized and collaborative effort, and it's going to require a team of lawyers, and it's going to require serious money. It can be done, but we won't know what the outcome will be, and there's a good case to be made that it is harming Jewish lives and putting Jewish lives in direct physical danger. We know from research that we did at Boundless during the May 2021 conflict, we were looking at the ways in which the discourse online actually connected to the real world violence in America, targeting Jews. And you could see the way in which the language online was quickly shifting. It was no longer in May 2021, in that 12-day period, about Israel and Hamas. It was about Jews. And the discourse shifted very fast. And so then Jews are used. They are talked about as being oppressors, colonialist settlers, ethnic cleansers. And then we see the way in which, and you can't say causality, but there is a connection to the real world targeting that was taking place during that May 2021 period through some of those social justice protests where Jews were physically harmed. In New York, in Los Angeles, in Florida, and a few other places. So yes, this is absolutely part of the conversation.
We have a question back here from Jesse, one of our 12th grade students.
Woohoo!
I feel lucky to get an introduction. So, like both of you, I'm lucky enough to be an alumni from Ramah. Ramah Pocono is the best one. And I went on Ramah seminar this past summer, which I think really built the foundation for my knowledge of Israel. Like, I feel like a lot of my peers do not have the same foundations that I have, because I feel like I saw a lot of the different things that are now being seen by the world in person with my own eyes before they really started. And I feel like the biggest issue, as a 12th grader at a public high school in Cherry Hill, a leader in different Jewish youth organizations and working with different teens that are Jewish in this area, the biggest issue that I see, and I think a lot of the kids around me see, is that there's not really any way to educate all of these students. Like, for instance, in Cherry Hill, there is a large population of Jewish students compared to other areas, and the majority of that large population does not know the facts. They don't know what's happening in Israel. They don't know how to stand up for Israel like most of the people in this room do. And like you see here, there's really not that many of us that even show up to events like this where this is an opportunity to learn about it. So I guess what I'm asking is, what's your advice on how teens like me and people sitting here can help the other teens that are really not learning this information know it? Because maybe it's important for them when they get to college, but it's also important for them now to know, to have that foundation and support of Israel and understanding maybe Israel's not always right, but why isn't Israel right? Why is Israel right? And things like that.
It's great. What's his name? What's your name? Jesse. Thank you. I'm ready to hire you. So Jesse, I kind of would throw it back to you. First of all, I would say, I don't know everything TBS is doing, but I have to imagine Rabbi Peltz and so many others are deeply involved in teaching about Israel here and teaching about anti-Semitism. So part of the question I would say to you is, how do you get your peers in the room? How do you get your friends to come? Right? Because Rabbi Peltz can't drag you all here, right? You can only lead the horse to water. You can't make the horse drink. So how do we help you guys? And how do we get you in the room so that we can do what we know how to do really well? And that's what your Jewish education is about, from Ramah, from here, from your day school, etc. So one, how do you get them in the room? Two, what do you need from us so that you can become the educator? Right? Is it going to be more impactful if you're sitting around the table with your friends? We'll support you, right? But what does it look like if you're the one saying, come to my house tonight, we're ordering pizza, and we're going to talk about 1967, right? We're going to talk about the 6-Day War. We're going to talk about what's happening on campus. Actually, let's talk about this hard issue of this term genocide and the way it's being used in the International Court of Justice, right? Like, what do you need from us? And I'm serious, because maybe you're the educator and the right messenger, and it shouldn't be us. You just need our support, guidance, whatever it is. The other piece I would say is that there's a program in Boston, it didn't start in Boston, but it's now in Boston, in which teens and high school kids particularly are going into different high school settings, not in a classroom necessarily, but meeting with teens, Jewish and non-Jewish, and humanizing Jews. I know Cherry Hill is very Jewish, but not every aspect of Cherry Hill still even knows a Jew. And so that kind of program allows teens to engage with their peers for the purpose of humanizing Jews, Judaism, and Israel. And what does it look like when you, again, are the one in that conversation, building that relationship and building the bridge, and not just receiving that conversation? So what I'm asking you, basically, Jesse, is because I see it in you already, and I like it, and I'm really good at intuition. So what I'm saying is, I actually want you, I'm going to tell you what my dad used to say to me. When something would happen, he would say, what are you going to do about it? So Jesse, what are you going to do about it? We're here for you. I will happily help anytime, but I want you to own it, because there are lots of programs. There are lots of opportunities, but we need your leadership in this moment and you to model for your friends what it looks like to be a proud Jewish adult.
So I think that's a great message to conclude on, not only for Jesse and all of our high school students, but really for each of us to think about the part we can play in all of this. It is it's a big and a complex problem, and it's not an easy one to fix, nor is it an easy one to navigate as a parent, as a student. as a rabbi in any sort of profession, but that's how we try to do it together here, and having conversations like this that can help frame the issues, help us begin to think about them and work on addressing them as best as we can. And having people like you working on it each and every day certainly make us feel pretty good too. So I want to say a big toda rabah again to Rachel Fish for being with us tonight. And thank you again to Gigi and Brad for making it possible. And I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight too. You are welcome to continue the conversation in the social hall with some desserts, and hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much for being here. Lila Tov.